Welcome to Two Way tonight, everyone. I'm Mark Halperin. Grateful to you for joining. If this were a normal administration, today would be a very big news day. But I got to tell you, by the standards of this administration, most nights when we gather, not as much news as usual. We do have for you a run through of the news and then three great guests, including Mike Abramowitz, who heads Voice of America. And he's going to talk to us. He's done a few interviews, but not that many, and none quite like this. So we'll get to Mike Abramowitz and then our two guests, Amber Duke of the Daily Caller, Adam Mockler of the Midas Touch, both of whom have been here before, both of them extraordinary voices that we love having part of the conversation. And of course, we want to get to your questions. If you'd like to get into the conversation and you're here on the two-way platform, please raise your hand. As always, we ask you to adhere to our ethos of peace, love, and understanding and the presumption of grace to all. And if you're watching on YouTube or X, please don't put smack in the chat. Enough said about that. All right, quickly in the news. Lots today going on in the courts, on social media, on cable TV, and L in the White House briefing regarding deportation, particularly focus on the deportation of the El Salvadoran folks who are said to be gang members. President Trump talked about this today. Stephen Miller talked about it. Tom Homan talked about it. And there's some defiance on the part of the White House regarding judicial rulings. So that's all happening. Nothing conclusive there, but a lot of back and forth. President Trump went to the Kennedy Center today, promised that there would be big changes. Senator Schumer, we talked this morning on the morning meeting about how he was going to handle his book tour, which by coincidence was starting today, supposed to start today in the wake of lots of criticism of him by folks within his own party. The book tour was canceled. His team said it was because of security concerns, but obviously it allows him to avoid having to answer questions at an inopportune time. President Trump teased two new, relatively, well, not new topics today, but re-teased two old topics today. One talks about trying to pull Hunter Biden's Social Security, Social Secret Service detail, and said that the JFK files that are coming tomorrow are going to be very interesting. All right, we'll talk about some of that at least with our guests, but first I want to bring in someone who I've known pretty much my whole life. Our fathers were friends for half a century. Michael Abramowitz. I also was colleagues with him. He was a Washington Post reporter and has done a lot of great work in the private sector and has been for some time now the head of the Voice of America, an institution that has spread the gospel of America around the world for quite some time, and now is under a review by DOJ and faces extremely broad cuts in what they do. So here is my friend, I will say, Mike Abramowitz, who is much in the news these days. Mike, welcome. Thank you for joining.
Of course, it's fantastic to be here, Mark. I'm really honored.
All right. So tell people who don't know, let's just start VOA 101. What does Voice of America do, and why has it been targeted, in your view, by the Trump administration for big cuts?
Okay, so Voice of America, we've been around for 83 years. We started off as a radio broadcaster that broadcasts information about the war in America, behind Nazi lines during World War II. We became a television broadcaster. Now, increasingly, we are a global digital platform. We have about 360 million either viewers, listeners, people who engage with us on social media. We publish in 49 different languages. We're really a very significant news operation. It's important to say we don't broadcast in the United States. We're prohibited by law from broadcasting in the United States. And really, our most important markets today are countries like China, Iran, Venezuela, Africa. And really, our mission, to put it bluntly, is to kind of tell the story about America to the world and to tell it in a factually balanced way. That actually is in the VOA charter, and that is what our roughly 1,400 journalists try to do every day.
Are you still the head of Voice of America?
I think on paper, I'm still the head of Voice of America. What happened is that the president had an executive order. Well, first of all, let me just back up for a second. So the president announced in December that he wanted Carrie Lake to become the head of Voice of America. Certain things have to happen legally for her to be installed. I've sort of made it clear that I see myself as a caretaker. I'm happy to, be helpful to her as she takes on these responsibilities. That's a genuine thing, Mark. You know me. I've worked in, with R's and D's my whole entire life, and that's important to me. I really want to be cooperative with her. Carrie Lake is now what's called a senior advisor to the acting CEO of U.S. Agency for Global Media, which is our parent company or parent organization. And essentially, the president has ordered USAGM, which includes Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, what some of you know, Radio Free Asia, a number of other entities. They've ordered the 7 agencies, including U.S. Agency for Global Media, to come back within 7 days with a plan for substantial reductions to really eliminate all what's quote unquote non-statutory functions of this agency. And that's honestly a little bit hard to know what exactly is meant by that. But the bottom line is that they put 1,300 employees, including myself, on administrative leave. And
is this eaten already?
Hold on there a second. Somebody's mic is open. We'll solve that. Go ahead.
Okay. Anyway, they put 1,300 of us on administrative leave. Actually, this weekend, they terminated the contracts of about 500 journalists who work for us. So really, the question I would say neutrally is, will VOA survive this? Will it be a smaller organization with maybe a slightly different mission? Will it go out of business entirely? And honestly, I've been asked that question by other media today, and the truth is I don't know, because I don't really know what's in the president's mind. I don't know what's in Carrie Lake's mind.
How big is the budget of Voice of America? And as someone who's very familiar with your operations, could it stand to be cut from where it is now?
Right. Our budget is roughly $270 million. I would say for the last 2 years, even before President Trump came into office, we have been cutting the budget, streamlining. My general view is that VOA can clearly be reformed. We are in a completely, as you know, Mark, a different media environment than when VOA was really prospered during the Cold War. I think, whereas during the Cold War, our problems were, how to get information behind the Iron Curtain. Today, it's how to combat propaganda, disinformation, misinformation. I don't know what the right word is, but basically the problem that I think needs to be solved, whether you have a VOA or not, is our national security rivals like China, Iran, Russia, Venezuela. They are flooding the zone with lots of false information. And VOA has traditionally been a very important source of really, truly non-biased, objective, accurate news and information for people living in these other countries. I still think that's a very valuable mission. Could it be rethought, reimagined, streamlined, modernized? Absolutely. Should we throw it out entirely? No.
So these other countries you mentioned, China, Iran, they have state media that creates lots of content, both for the home audience and around the world. It seems like some part of the MAGA movement would like the function of providing counter information that's reflects the American point of view to be done by the private sector. What are the chances if VOA is eliminated or scaled back to near nothing, that the private sector would pump language appropriate messages into, say, China and Iran?
Right. Well, I think there are two issues. I think that's a good question. I think that there are private sector organizations that exist now that are trying to get information into these countries. So, for instance, there's something called the Iran International, which I believe is funded by the Saudis or one of the Middle East, which has a very active program on Iran, which is sort of comparable, in size, I think, to VOA, maybe even a little bit bigger. They have more money than VOA, Persian network. In China, you've got private people, the New York Times, other people trying to get into China. I think number one, I'm skeptical of the business model for a private sector kind of VOA, if you imagine. And I think I'm not sure it's possible. Maybe someone smarter than I can think of that business model. But I also think the newsroom of VOA is extremely unusual because it's people from these countries who speak the local languages, who know the local markets really much better than, say, like someone from CNN or someone from Fox. It's just a different entity. It's a very unique news service, and it's taken 83 years to build it up. And I'm call me a little bit skeptical that it could be built up. Not saying things can't be done differently, but I just think that's a very unique quality of VOA, that sort of news service. And we really have really fine journalists, by the way.
So, as you know, one of the ways that Doge has operated is, and the administration is to find the weak links, to find aspects of programs that they say prove that it's not worthy of the taxpayers' money. And in some cases, that means things that they find to be left leaning or woke. Um, I just got texted a headline which purports to be from a VOA story. I'm sure you've seen this already. Headline is, "What is white privilege and whom does it help?" I don't know if that's a real headline or not. I suspect it is, but is VOA too woke? Is it too much like National Public Radio or something else liberal that the administration doesn't want to fund because your journalists are, like many journalists in Washington, liberal?
Right. Well, let me say, I think one thing that's important to understand about VOA is that it's not like one newsroom. Okay. When VOA started, there was a giant kind of English language newsroom, which is basically made up of Americans. And then that news service content was translated by other people to go to the world. Today, that English language newsroom is much smaller and really kind of much more marginal to the size of to the mission of VOA. Honestly, I would have substantially cut, even eliminated the English language news center and really pushed the resources into Iran, into China, into Russia, into Latin America, into Africa. You know what and really created a smaller, more nimble desk to cover America. I think that, honestly, if you're talking politically, the biggest things that people have taken a shot at with VOA are typically what's produced by the English language news center. We get, to be honest, most people on the Hill, both Republican and Democrats, don't pay that much attention to VOA. But to the extent that they do, they get mad at a headline, like you mentioned, which is not appropriate. Well, actually, let me say, I don't know the headline. I'm not going to speak to an individual thing, but let me just say there are things that I've seen that I would not agree with. But I think you have to understand that there's just hundreds of stories and videos that are going out every day. There's actually no possible way that me or Kara Lake could know everything that goes out. One thing that's very interesting about VOA is that we have each language service undergo a review every year for bias, fairness, etc. And that, finds that I think we do pretty well relative to the mainstream press. Are we perfect? No. But I think that if I were to say there's a kind of bias within the newsroom, it's like a pro-freedom bias. It's an anti-totalitarian bias. We've got these incredible journalists who were like kicked out of Russia, kicked out of China, who can't practice free press where they are, and they've come to America and they are trying to report on America for the people that they left behind in a fair and balanced way. That's the way I see VOA.
If President Trump called you and said, "Michael, I saw you on Two-Way tonight, and I understand the importance of counteracting America's enemies around the world and inspiring voices for freedom. But Michael, we got to save the taxpayers' money, and we can't have the government being in the business of journalism. That doesn't make any sense." How would you answer him?
Well, I would say that I think my basic message these days, and by the way, this has been consistent since I took over. I don't believe this is a nice to have. I think this is a critical national security imperative for the United States, right? I remember talking to a senior person in the Biden administration when I took this job, and he was expressing a lot of concern because China and Russia had this kind of top-down, highly integrated, highly strategic, highly synthetic, basically information strategy, right? And their strategy is focused on disinformation, propaganda, lies, but they're very effective at it. And what you see in important parts of Latin America, Africa, you see Russia and China really getting a toehold in the media. And that's bad because they're spreading anti-American narratives. So my feeling, honestly, is if VOA didn't exist, it would have to be reinvented because it's important to counteract those narratives. And I don't see the private sector media doing it. So I would say, with respect, let's sit down. Let's, number one, think about what your most important foreign policy priorities are, right? If you want to focus on Iran, if you want to focus on China, let's look at how accurate information, unbiased, objective news. I think one important thing, Mark, about VOA, I'm not saying there's not a role in government for propaganda or for, narrative building, and that should come from the State Department or the White House. I think there's a role for an independent, objective news organization, because, by the way, there's a high level of trust for VOA around the world. We just did a survey of our programs in Ukraine. 99% of Ukrainians trust VOA. That's an incredible statistic. And that is far different than most media and other people. People come to VOA because they know they're going to get something that they don't get from state-controlled media in their own countries.
Amber Duke is here. She writes for the Daily Caller. And Amber, great to have you here. Question for Michael.
Absolutely.
Hi,
So I'd love to just follow up on what Mark was talking about with that headline about white privilege. Voice of America recently came under fire as well for a directive from one of your editors saying that Hamas should not be referred to as a terrorist group without using quotes because they were not supposed to demonize that group. Now, it is official U.S. policy that Hamas is considered a foreign terrorist organization. So where is the disconnect between that editor's directive and your insistence that Voice of America is basically meant to promote the American foreign policy line abroad?
Right. So let me just say, first of all, Voice of America journalists regularly describe Hamas as terrorists. That is not an issue. I've made that clear, that they can be described as terrorists because they are terrorists. That's what Hamas is. They're a terrorist group. Sometimes VOA reporters use a formulation, designated by the United States as a terrorist group, which might be appropriate in certain stories. But there was, before I got to VOA, a directive. It wasn't really a directive, but there was, what we have in VOA is a editor who kind of polices standards. I'm just being open with you. The editor, who's a very good editor, said something in an email to the staff, which really didn't really reflect what the official policy was. We tried to correct it, and that mistake, I think, has been killing us since then. But Hamas are terrorists, full stop.
I'm not sure what happened to Mark, so I'll go ahead and ask another question.
I'm right here, but go ahead.
Okay, great.
Ask
Yeah, sure. The other one I had was that there were several Voice of America reporters who in 2019, when Trump was still the president, were on their professional Twitter accounts tweeting about how much they disliked the president and how they had these disagreements with him. He was a threat to democracy, things of that nature. So it just seems like there's a lot of evidence in the past 5 years of Voice of America leaning in one direction. And that's one of the reasons why people feel uncomfortable with their taxpayer dollars going to your venture.
Well, look, Amber, with respect, that episode was 5 years ago. By the way, I think it's totally inappropriate, and I've made it clear to reporters since I've been at VOA, which has been for 9 months. I think it's totally inappropriate for any reporter, whoever the president is, whatever administration, to be advertising their personal opinions, political opinions, on social media. Because to me, and we have a clear social media policy that prohibits that. And in fact, we have a process by which people get disciplined for that, for egregious violations. There's a First Amendment in the country, which I want to respect, but there's also a standards issue that if people come to work for VOA or any news organization, like if you're at the New York Times, the Washington Post, Fox News, wherever, I don't think it's appropriate personally for reporters to be talking about, especially if you're covering the White House. Look, you can't control people's beliefs, right? People believe what they believe and people bring that. But when you're good journalists, you check those you check your biases at the door, and you don't do anything that would call into question your objectivity. So that's the way it's been at VOA since I've been there. I think there's a widespread agreement on that, and I think, honestly, the VOA reporters, by and large, are very strong on being balanced and objective. Can you find exceptions to that? Of course you can. And one thing that VOA I've experienced is very good in my time is that when they see a mistake or they see an error of a lapse in standards, they correct it. That's really, every news organization does that. And I honestly, I'm not trying to say everything's perfect, but I think VOA, in terms of the balance issue, is pretty good, and I would defend it.
Amber, besides the kind of things you pointed out, which lots of people have problems with, do you like the mission of VOA historically? Do you think it's an important function to counter information in places like Iran and China, or you'd like to see it abolished, not based on the examples you cited, but based on the mission?
One thing that I have concerns about it, and Michael, you could probably address this as well, is what is the relationship between VOA and groups like the CIA and the FBI? How officially are you connected to the US intelligence community?
There's no connection. We're independent. In fact, we operate under a law that dates back to 1976, which says that the Secretary of State and the CEO of the U.S. Agency for Global Media should respect the editorial integrity of VOA. I think the only area where we interact with law enforcement is really on I guess two issues. One is background checks for people who come to work at VOA. I mean, this is a big issue, making sure that people here, don't have problems, don't have, connections to foreign intelligence services. I mean, if you're hiring a global audience, if you're hiring a global workforce that comes from these countries, you got to be careful. And that is a very serious issue that I took very seriously. I ordered, when I was at VOA, heightened background investigation. I asked for heightened background investigations from USAGM for our journalists, and so I think that's a really legitimate thing. But other than that, there's not really any kind of law enforcement connection.
Adam, thank you for your patience. I'm going to turn Michael over to you in a minute, but Amber, I just want to press you a little bit in a friendly way. Leaving aside concerns of the kind you've raised, do you think that the government should have an arm that produces information in the applicable languages for, say, Iran and China, to try to get information in there, or you don't think that's a taxpayer-worthy function?
I'm kind of split on that, to be honest with you, Mark, because I think there is an argument to be made that having an information arm of the government to make sure American values are being appropriately communicated throughout the world, but there's also just a general sort of negative reaction to the idea of propaganda. So that's where I kind of sit on this.
Thank you, Amber. Adam, thank you again for your patience. Questions for Michael, please.
Yeah, I think that, just broadly, I think it's easy to press Michael on specific headlines, but I think that the U.S. or the mission of Voice of America seems pretty noble. It seems like they have a diverse amount of viewpoints, which kind of represents the voices within America. There are diverse sectors of people who do believe in white privilege. I'm sure there are articles on the other side as well. I mean, it's just reflecting American values, but what people in America think. I think that, while the mission is noble, it kind of reminds me of the conversation we had last time I was on your show. What was the guy's name? He was smoking a cigar on his boat.
Alex Castellanos.
Alex, yeah, sorry, I should know that. Probably
That's okay. All good.
But he was saying that Elon Musk is currently, and Donald Trump are currently doing surgery on the government, and sometimes some tissue has to come out. And I was actually thinking about that, and I was thinking, isn't surgery rather precise? Wouldn't it be more precise to come to Michael himself and ask, hey, can you give us receipts on who you're paying, what you're doing, what your operations are, and we'll cut down and make sure that you're more efficient. But instead, it seems like they're kind of just nuking the entire agency, which in my opinion seems to be too far. And it seems to be indicative of Donald Trump's slash and burn method of tearing down agencies when there's probably a better way to do it. I mean, with the NIH, for example, you could ask for the head of these agencies at the NIH to report back with certain receipts or their payments, but it seems like they're just kind of going in with the chainsaw, literally running around with the chainsaw on stage. So any questions to Michael? Not really, no.
Okay, thank you, Adam. We want to get your questions on this topic. So if your hand's up, I'm expecting right now, at least you'll ask a question about VOA. If you've got questions about other stuff, you can lower your hand for now, and we'll bring you back in a minute. A little bit of news before I start going to the community. President Trump on Truth Social just said he is pulling the Secret Service details for both Hunter and Ashley Biden. And he had various reasons for that that he gave, but that'll be quite a topic over the next few news cycles, I think. All right, let's start with Matthew Bartlett, who has a history in dealing with these here. Explain to folks your connection to American foreign policy and question for Michael, Adam, and Amber after you unmute. Go ahead, Matthew. Go ahead and unmute.
Hey, I think
One more time.
okay. I think you can hear me now. Thank you
There you
so
go.
much. Served at the
Yes.
State Department. I was the communications director for the Educational and Cultural Affairs Bureau. We had quite a bit of, I guess you could call interaction with VOA. And Michael, boy, 9 months. It sounds like you are the right person to head VOA. I applaud everything that you have said because what you've said is in America's strategic interest. But if I'm being candid, the reality that we, at least, or perception that was our reality, was that VOA was quite the opposite. And it was propaganda against the US, that it was telling bad narratives around the United States. We could not get a good VOA story. And the question is, why are we the taxpayer paying for anti-US propaganda around the world? So that was, what we faced.
Matthew, what's an example of something that you saw that you considered anti-US propaganda?
Gosh, this is about 4 years ago. I would just say we were always, poised for VOA because the questions and the coverage seemed to not just have a, left-leaning bias, but an anti-US bias. And as a Trump administration, it was always problematic with VOA. Again, the mission that you articulated seemed to be, advancing American interests would be welcomed, but we felt as if the reality of it was advancing, you talked about China, you talked about Iran, you talk about anti-American sentiment, and that VOA was very unfortunately, many of their reporters were putting in their own ideology, their own footprint, and this was something that was backfiring. So again, that was, where we were coming from, recognizing that you've been there for 9 months.
Okay, I know you said it's been a long time. You can't think of a specific. I'll just say before we turn it to Michael, it's difficult to me to respond to that without any specifics. But Michael, I have heard that not just from Matthew, but from other Republicans and not just from Trump Republicans. So what would you say to that?
It's hard to react to like a general accusation. And I think it's hard to overstate the amount of news that VOA produces every day. We have a Tibet service, a Bambara service, a French to Africa service, a Spanish to Latin America service. We produce hundreds and hundreds of stories and videos and texts. And, I'm not saying we get it from the other side too. But it's striking to me that when VOA was shuttered over the weekend, that the national security rivals of the United States in China and Iran were happy. They were happy because basically the United States, in their view, was shuttering the news that they want to prevent their people from accessing. So, I'll give you a story. One of my big priorities at VOA in my short months was to really try to elevate and improve our China coverage. That's a really important issue. And one of the things that we often did on VOA, there's a huge appetite in China for really talk and conversation, kind of like this, on topics of public affairs. So when we do, like, we had a guy from Harvard who was an economist talking for an hour and a half in a very lucid way about the Chinese economy. We had a person from the Trump campaign and a person from the Biden campaign, debating in Chinese, in Mandarin, the foreign policy of Biden and Trump. That's not something that Chinese citizens get, and that is VOA at its best. And honestly, VOA is a huge brand. I always think about, the head of our China team who was at Tiananmen Square. She was inspired because during that revolution, the only way that the Chinese people got accurate, if the students got accurate information on what was going on in Tiananmen Square, was they took down they handwrote the VOA broadcasts that were coming in by radio, and they spread it around, by paper. And that inspired her. And she came to America because she really had her name is Xin Chen, and she really wanted to make a difference in journalism. And she came to VOA, and she is right now really focusing the China division on exposing China's human rights violation, explaining America to China in a fair way. It's really something that I really believe in the mission. I also believe that by and large, our reporters do it well. Are there mistakes? Is there bias? Of course, but I'm not going. But I don't think. I think that it's easy to take isolated examples and make a bigger story out of this. I truly think that if we shut down VOA, it's going to be a self-inflicted wound. And I'm not saying that VOA has to be exactly the way it is. I would be in favor of a radical, rethinking about how the news is operated. It can be definitely more digital. There's lots of things that can be done. And, I think that the VOA staff would be very open to working with the new Trump administration on that. They have a history of basically, taking direction from whatever administration happens to be in power. And so I just think rather than this kind of, indiscriminate cutting, I think it would have been better if the whole thing had been reviewed carefully with an identification of strategic priorities, then figure out a plan to get there. I know that's not the way this administration has tended to do things, but that's the way I think it would have been better. I mean, I've been at VOA for 8 or 9 months. I still feel I don't know the institution that well, and it's a big institution and complicated.
Matthew, thank you. Michael, we kept you a little bit longer than we had discussed, so I want to thank you for being part of the conversation. And as this goes forward, I hope you'll come back and share with folks your thoughts about how this evolves.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your great audience. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael. Great to see you. All right. Again, grateful to Adam and for Amber for participating in that. And as I said, love having you both on. I want to get your views on what's happened last week, starting with Adam, with Senator Schumer. Obviously, this is a personality issue. It's kind of a soap opera thing of the tensions within the elite levels of the party, but the grassroots really cares a lot about this too. So, Adam, where do you think the events of last week, where Senator Schumer has been so criticized, even by some of his allies, where does that leave the Democratic Party?
I think one of the main mistakes that Schumer made was not presenting a unified front, or actually just backstabbing a lot of his House Democrats and actually Senate Democrats by saying that he was going to vote no on cloture and then last minute switching. I mean, I understand his arguments. I empathize with his arguments. He's scared that a government shutdown would only further embolden Trump and Doge. I guess House Democrats are making the inverse arguments. I don't know. It's rough to tell where it's going to go. I saw a poll showing that AOC is now the most popular leader within the Democratic Party. I'm not sure what the sample size was there, but it sounds about right. She's been a really effective messenger. I've seen people online calling for a sort of 2012 Tea Party of the Democratic Party where we sort of embrace the AOC side. It's hard to tell where it goes, but Senator Schumer definitely pissed a lot of people off just by not presenting a unified front. If he from the beginning would have presented the argument that he made at the very end, it probably would have gone better for him.
Amber, how much disarray do you think the Democrats are in, and what are the implications?
Well, the polling certainly doesn't look good for the Democrats. Their approval rating is at a near historic low. And the same people polled on that question say that they feel that the only thing the Democrats are doing is trying to oppose Trump right now. And I think the broader question for the Democratic base that was pushing back against Chuck Schumer is what exactly would you have him do? Okay, you go into a government shutdown. The majority of the American people blame the Democrats for that shutdown. And then on the other side of it, do you get a bill that is more in line with the Democrat thinking on a continuing resolution? Probably not. In fact, you probably just anger the Republicans and end up with an even worse deal. So I think the question is, what is the alternative? Is it actually going to be better for Democrats? I don't think the conditions are such that that would be the case.
Okay. We're going to get to your questions in just a minute, so please raise your hand. Any topics are fair game. Amber, you first this time. Two groups of people seem unhappy with the current performance to date of the Trump administration on the economy. One is a lot of elites, Wall Street elites, and other elites who don't like the tariff policy and don't necessarily love all the way Doge has been conducted. And the other is voters. The polls are pretty clear. Not all the President Trump's numbers are down. Some are in fact up from where he's been, but his ratings on handling the economy in a lot of polls are down. So what accounts for it? And do you think that that it's a problem for the administration that a lot of Americans feel he's not doing a good job on the economy right now?
Well, I think America, in a lot of ways, is a country of instant gratification, and tariff policy is something that has to be looked at through a long-term lens. And for me, tariffs are not just an economic question, but they're also a cultural question. And it's a question of what kind of country do we want to be? Do we want to be a country where we've lost millions of manufacturing jobs over the past 20 years, hollowing out the middle class? Or do we want to be a country where we can build things here? Do we want to be a country that, for example, is reliant on China to produce our PPE, and then during a pandemic, they decide to hoard it and don't even show up for a court case worth $20 billion in order to defend themselves for that behavior? Or do we want to reshore those key supply lines, whether it's PPE, steel, timber, to make sure that in a national security emergency, the US is able to supply itself? Those are all legitimate questions outside of short-term economic impacts. And I'd also say that despite the potential economic turmoil, obviously the stock market has been dropping pretty significantly over the past few days. We also see that the percentage of people who say that the country is on the right track rather, increased from the mid-20s to 44%, which is the highest that it's been since, I believe, 2012. So I think overall, people are actually quite satisfied with the Trump administration. And unfortunately, a little bit of short-term economic pain, I think, is necessary in order to rebuild the middle class in a way that is sustainable and healthy in the long term.
Adam, same question.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about short-term economic pain and instant gratification, but the reason people expect that is because that's kind of what Trump promised. He said on day one, prices would lower. He said on day one, the war in Ukraine would end.
Well, prices are down.
He was honestly, well, if inflation, with his unpredictable inflationary policies, I'm not sure they'll stay down for long. I saw the Target CEO came out about a week ago and said prices may go up. JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon, who said a few months ago, get over it, is now saying you're creating kind of an uncertain environment for business owners. Business owners need a predictable environment if you want to be able to thrive and operate. And when Trump is doing this, like, will I, won't I with tariffs, where he's making these demands about fentanyl, but it doesn't really seem to be about fentanyl. I mean, what concessions has Trump really gotten out of Trudeau and Sheinbaum? Because as far as I'm aware, the $1.3 billion, that was allocated in December. You can check that. The 10,000 troops on the border, Biden got the same thing without almost causing a trade war. So what concessions did he actually get?
All right,
Well,
Amber, you want to...
Yeah,
ahead,
the 10,000 National Guard members were not deployed under Joe Biden. That was actually, no, they were not.
And under Trump's first term.
Yes, they were done in Trump's first term during a similar deal with Mexico, where Trump threatened to pull foreign funding from Mexico if they didn't comply with that deal. We actually had a reporter down embedded with the Mexican National Guard just this past month. And the National Guard was very clear that they have changed their operations in order to go into hotspots where the Mexican cartel is operating, both to traffic humans and drugs. We've also seen border numbers fall to a historic low, 20,000 per month apprehended at the southern border. For comparison, under Joe Biden, 250,000 at its peak. In Trump's first term, the peak was May of 2019, at about 120,000. So you're clearly seeing results on that issue. Now, I agree with you that I'd like to hear the administration talk more openly about what additional concessions they would like from Mexico and Canada, because they haven't been clear on what else they would like to add. And they should be open and honest about that instead of hiding those negotiations from the public.
Can I ask you, does it not bother you a slight bit that Trump did seem to promise he would lower prices on day one? I'm not sure all prices have lowered.
Prices are down. Inflation fell more than economists anticipated in the last month, and egg and gas prices are down as well.
Off of the back of Biden, but also the S&P 500 is tanking due to the unpredictable environment. So I'm just not sure he's creating the economic environment he promised. And he did promise kind of instant gratification, no?
Well, as you know, stock markets are, of course, predicated on certainty in the market, predictability. It's true that Trump's current economic policy with the tariffs is unpredictable, but the stock market is not the best indicator of the health of the middle class, right? That's an indicator of what's going on with wealthy business owners, which I think you would agree as a member of the left is not the best way to measure American economic success.
No, it's not the best indicator. There's a lot of people's 401ks are down. That was the point.
Okay, you two could keep going back and forth, and I'm enjoying it. But I want to get some folks in. So, to Cruz, welcome in. Tell folks who don't know where you are and what's on your mind.
Yeah, I live in Seattle, Washington, a little bit south of Seattle, and the reason I'm on, and this is a perfect audience for this question. And first of all, Mark, thank you so much for this platform. I've been watching on YouTube and finally figured out how to join the conversation. I feel like the MAGA contingent of the government right now, they're acting as if they won a revolution when in fact they may have won a battle in a cold civil war. As in the things that they're carrying out seems very revolutionary. And Amber, maybe you can speak into this, like there are midterms coming up, right? Can the Trump administration survive, or can Republicans survive the midterms and continue kind of these revolutionary tactics that are happening? I just don't understand how this is sustainable. It just seems so drastic, all the changes that are coming or have been happening. Thank
you. Amber.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think Republicans are under no illusion that the midterms are probably a lost cause, not just because of polling or whatever the backlash to the Trump administration is going to be doing, but just out of typical political cycles, which is when you have complete control of the Senate, the House, and the president. Usually in the next midterm cycle, it goes back to the other party because most American voters like some kind of balance. As much as people say government doesn't work well enough, they don't like when Congress is deadlocked. Actually, they usually vote for Congress to be deadlocked because they don't like a lot of change in a short period of time. So I think that's probably almost an inevitability. And even when you look at the congressional map, the way the districts are drawn, there are basically 5 seats that really matter. There's basically only a 5-seat majority that Republicans could really hope for if they poured all of their resources into it. So them having a 1 to 2 seat majority is pretty much in line with what the congressional maps look like. That's a hard majority to keep a hold of. If you talk to people within the Trump administration or people who were on the campaign, they were pretty clear-eyed and sober about the fact that they probably didn't have 4 years to enact the agenda. They probably had 18 months. So that's why they're operating so quickly, because they realize that time is probably limited. And if I had one criticism of the Republican Party in this latest CR fight, it's that why bother doing the short-term spending bill through September when you have popular support on the side of DOGE right now? You have 76% of Americans saying that they want to cut government waste, fraud, and abuse. Take advantage of that political opportunity and actually codify into law the programs that DOGE is identifying for cuts, codify into law the executive orders that Trump has been handing down, and make sure that those things are more permanent than just the whims of an executive that could be overturned in 4 years.
Amber, before Adam responds, why do you think they didn't do that?
You're going to get me into a lot of criticisms of the Republican Party, which is actually a criticism of both parties in Congress, which is they like to offload responsibility. They don't want to take political accountability for their actions. And Trump has shown them what a little bit of political will can accomplish. And it seems to be the case that Republicans are really good at being the minority party, but not so good at governing when they actually have power. And we saw this with the USAID question, right? This is a broader issue across Congress, where Congress was writing incredibly vague spending bills, giving massive grants to USAID to do effectively whatever the executive wanted with it, which is why all of these quote unquote woke programs under Biden were allowed to happen in the first place. If Congress actually did its job and wrote a funding bill that provided money for specific allocated programs, then the executive wouldn't have so much discretion over where the money goes.
Adam.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Amber on political cycles regarding the midterms. That seems to be common sense. But I do think that all of this turmoil is only going to be accelerated by Trump's lack of predictability. Also, some of the stunts that he's doing, like selling Teslas on the front lawn. I saw a picture of Conor McGregor in the White House today. I thought it was fake at first, but I guess that's real. I feel like if he continues these stunts, combined with Elon Musk's really brazen form of slashing and burning the government, yeah, I'm not sure how the midterms will go. I mean, either way, it seems to be like the political cycle, as Amber was saying.
Dick Cruz, thank you so much for coming in. Appreciate it. Hey, Noah, do we have that photo you said from the Kennedy Center? I think Adam would get a kick out of it. We're able to put that up.
Is it
Yeah,
the
we
J6
do.
Choir,
No,
or has
okay.
that not happened yet?
Is it what?
Here
Is
it
the
is.
J6 Choir, or has that not happened?
I don't know if that happened. Anyway, take a look at this. What do you think of that, Adam? That's him at the Kennedy Center in the presidential box.
I mean, I don't know. What am I supposed to say?
I don't know.
It's a cool photo, whatever. Yeah.
All right. Cool photo. All right. Some people thought it looked a little like like a dictatorate. Like
No, it's really blurry. I don't really
Yeah.
like. I'm not going to
All
call
right.
him a dictator because of a photo. I'd probably
All right.
point to his like denial of the last election.
Yeah. All right. There you go. All right. Thank you. I hadn't seen it. Melanie, welcome in. Thank you for coming. Tell folks who don't know where you are and what's on your mind today.
I am in rural Western North Carolina, formerly grew up in New York. I have a question for all of you about something that I feel like really flew under the radar, and it was when the Commerce Secretary talked about tariffs, and he talked about how the robots, we were going to have robots build iPhones, sorry, and that we were going to bring all these jobs with these tariffs create jobs, and that we will create, quote, millions and millions of jobs that are not college educated to build these robots. I see those jobs, and I find it very hard to believe that we will have millions and millions of jobs building robots, especially because I do not see those jobs as permanent. Once those robots are built, you kind of max out. This is not a continual output of items like you would with an iPhone. And I feel like it's kind of really set up, these tariffs are set up to line the pockets of big business and not so much to help the little guy. And the little guy would benefit a lot if you're going to say, yeah, the little guy is going to build an iPhone. And we're going to bring that here, and we're going to have all these jobs, these continuous jobs. And instead, that's not really what's happening. I feel like that's what's put out there. But really, the Commerce Secretary kind of said the quiet part out loud, in my opinion. And he said, oh, yeah, we're just going to have all these robots, and it's going to be great. I'm curious what everyone's thoughts are on that. And thank you for for being patient with me.
No, very good, Melanie. Thank you for that. Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, I feel like one of the things people don't talk a lot about regarding tariffs is that it actually opens up a country to corruption in a lot of ways, because you can either get favors or you can leverage the tariffs over other countries. It's used by a lot of more authoritarian countries, and I'm not saying Trump is using them in that way, but I think that the main thing that bothers me about Trump's tariffs, just to back up a little bit, and I want to ask this to Amber, and then you can answer the other question from Melanie. Do you think there's a way, like ideally with tariffs, to at least leave a grace period to reshore manufacturing rather than on like month one, just enacting a bunch of tariffs? Wouldn't ideally you leave like 6 to 12 months for manufacturers to get their stuff together?
Well, I think the problem with that is that there's not a monetary or financial incentive for companies to do that. And that's what the tariffs provide. Because when we're talking about third world countries or China, one of the huge advantages that they have over the American workforce is that they are willing to pay their people slave wages. Luckily, the US is not willing to do that unless you're Joe Biden and you import millions of illegal immigrants, which undercuts American wages. But no sane company operating for their financial benefit is going to choose to operate in the United States unless they have a CEO who happens to be a rah-rah America first kind of guy, paying livable wages, with all the benefits when they can manufacture things in Taiwan, China, Vietnam, etc. And so the whole point is that you have to create a financial incentive for countries to bring their jobs back here. And when the Commerce Secretary is talking about training Americans to build robots and they're going to have millions of jobs, it's obviously a simplistic way of explaining the problem, but it's getting at the heart of that issue, which is that you have to have fair and reciprocal trade with other countries. Otherwise, your own labor is going to be undercut because countries are going to flee to the lowest common denominator. And again, not only should we not want that in America, but I don't think we should want that in a global economy where we're willing to have an iPhone that costs, let's say, $25 cheaper, but it was built by a child in China. I think that's patently ridiculous as a country that believes in values and morals to say that that's an appropriate thing that we should accept from our trading partners. And when we're talking about, the leverage with other countries, America's not putting tariffs on countries that don't charge us anything to export our goods. They're reciprocal tariffs, which means they're matching the same tariff that's put on us by countries like China, in Europe, by Canada, by Mexico. And I'll give you a specific example of that. Canada has what's called the Digital Services Act, which is a tariff on basically advertising revenue that's brought about by online content creation. So Meta's a US-based company. If a Canadian content creator decides to make a video on Instagram and they make X number of dollars through advertising, Instagram gets a cut of that, right? Well, Canada charges a tariff on that profit made by Instagram so that Canada is getting a cut of their income. So that's less money that the US government obviously is getting through tax revenue. That's less money that's being reinvested back into that American company. That's bad for America. So if Canada is going to pull a percentage of profits from an American company through something like that, is it only fair that America responds in kind?
Okay, awesome. I'm grateful to both of you for those answers. I'm going to ask Melanie a question. Melanie a question. While I do, I'm going to warn you what I'm going to ask you both next. I'd love to know if you were in the pool tomorrow and got a chance to ask President Trump a question, what would your question be? Amber and Adam, think about that. Melanie, how did you find out about two-way?
It came up in my algorithm on my YouTube algorithm. And honestly, to be honest, I used to be a very old school establishment Democrat until Bernie Sanders got on my radar. And I was still kind of in that MSNBC world. And then, if you would have said to me, I would enjoy a show with Sean Spicer, I would have challenged you hard on that. But I yearn for this kind of content. I need the rhetoric to come down, no smack in the chat. I need that. I yearn for it. So when I saw your show and I went, Halperin, okay. And then I saw Spicer, I went, I watched it, loved it, and that's how I found you.
Thank you, Melanie. Loved all that answer. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming. Come back regularly, please. All right, Amber, you're in the pool tomorrow. What do you ask?
I have two questions because Trump will usually give you two in my experience. So the first one would be precisely what I brought up earlier, which is why not have Congress codify your cuts that you've identified into legislation now? Why wait until September? What is the negotiation looking like with Speaker Mike Johnson and Majority Leader Thune? And then the second question is a little bit less of a news of the day question, a little bit more evergreen. Trump is obviously a huge fan of President Andrew Jackson. There's been a move by the Treasury Department that started under Joe Biden to replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill with Harriet Tubman. I don't think that there's an argument for not putting Harriet Tubman on the bill, but would you, Mr. President, consider having two versions of the $20 bill or putting Andrew Jackson on a different currency amount in order to make sure that he's continuously honored by the American economy?
I can tell you that's not on Adam's list, but it's an excellent question. Adam, I'll give you two questions since Amber took two. If you're in the pool, what would you ask the president?
Amber stole my Andrew Jackson one.
No, she didn't.
No, but I would probably ask, Trump seems to be under this impression that Putin will do him a favor and just never reinvade Ukraine if they sign a peace deal under him. So I would say, why do you think Putin will give you this favor when he's consistently shown that he will reinvade Ukraine over and over? I mean, it's kind of Russia's strategy to start a war, pause it, and then reinvade that country later on after they've rearmed. So it kind of scares me when he tries to offer a deal without explicit security guarantees. I get the mineral deal. I get the implicit security guarantees he's offering. But regarding my second question, I don't know. Like, I feel like he doesn't really give thorough answers. The first one, he would just be like, it never would have happened in the first place. It never would have happened. He just says that over and over. So regarding a second question, maybe something about Doge, but I'd have to think about it.
All right. Last question for you guys. I finally had a chance to listen to all of the Gavin Newsom interviews on his podcast with Michael Savage and Steve Bannon and Charlie Kirk. I don't know. Have you guys listened to him?
Mostly,
I've
yeah.
seen a lot of it, yeah.
Okay. I'd love to know first Amber, then Adam. I think they're great for having the kind of conversations we have here. I liked how they got along. I liked how they looked for common ground. There was a little bit of sniping and snark, but I like that. But I think it's politically just horrible for Gavin Newsom, and I'm amazed anyone thinks otherwise. So, Amber, how do you feel about them as dialogue, and what do you think of the politics of it for Gavin Newsom?
Well, I think I have a lot of complaints about Gavin Newsom from a policy perspective, but I have a little bit of a different perspective on this from a political strategy standpoint, which is that it's actually kind of brilliant because Gavin Newsom gets to have this platform where he's having these sort of buddy, jovial conversations with people on the opposite side of the aisle with them. And they're getting their snipes in about his COVID policy, his economic policies in California that are driving people away. And it kind of nullifies them a little bit if he decides to run for president in 2028. Not only that, but he's going to have, 4 years of debating practice on how to defend himself from those policies and how to run away from them. I mean, this guy said on his podcast that he wasn't involved in any of the woke Latinx stuff when he was tweeting from his own account the word Latinx. But 4 years from now, that's going to seem like it's already been covered, right? That's already ground that's been trodden. So it's actually kind of politically brilliant for him as a way of starting to move towards the center in a way that will sort of nullify that criticism when it comes up 4 years from now, because he can say, look, I already addressed that on my podcast. Go watch my interview with Charlie Kirk.
Interesting. Totally disagree, but respect your point of view. Adam.
I've watched a few of them. I thought the Steve Bannon one was pretty fascinating. I thought the Charlie Kirk one was decent. I just kind of wish he would push back and defend his views a little bit more. I understand why he's not. I totally understand what he's going for, but I just feel like if you're going to have Charlie Kirk on, at least like stand up for what you've done a little bit in the past. As far as political strategy, I kind of agree with Amber. It's probably solid. Think about how much that one clip from the ACLU in 2019 like nuked Kamala's campaign. Now Newsom's going to have all of these clips from 2025 of him talking about pretty rational things. So when people try to dig up clips of him in the recent past, they're going to find clips of him talking to Steve Bannon and Charlie Kirk. I think it does successfully moderate him. I know a lot of Democrats are mad at it, but like, they'll get over it. They got to stop purity testing people for just having simple conversations. But overall, probably good for the space to be having these conversations.
Okay. Do you guys think if he ran for president, he'd have a good chance of not just winning the nomination, but the general election?
I think he'd win the nomination. The general would be tough. I mean, again, 4 years, a lot of things can happen in 4 years. It depends on who he's running against. J.D. Vance, I don't think he's got a shot. I think he would get eaten up in a debate with J.D. Vance.
I think Newsom's pretty sharp. I always say, like, in 2004, when the Democrats lost, no one really knew Obama was going to take the nation by storm 4 years later. Same thing with 2012. Republicans were doing postmortems on where to go with the party, and then Trump comes along 4 years later. So we don't know. Like Amber said, a lot can happen in 4 years. I think Gavin Newsom's a little bit too, like, slicked back hair, California type. But I do think he'd be a decent candidate on the national stage. You can't deny that he's charismatic. Would he win the nomination? Maybe. It really depends. I don't know.
Adam, if I were your stylist, I would get you some of Newsom's product for that hair of yours.
Yeah, I know. My comments say the same thing. I always get emails like, get a haircut, kid.
No, just some product, just some Newsome product.
Yeah.
I liked all our guests. I'm grateful to all our guests. I love having the two of you on. I just think you're so interesting and smart and not afraid to say things, even if it's a little bit off from the conventional wisdom of your party. So grateful to you both, and I hope you'll come back regularly.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. Will do.
Thank you. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you at 9 a.m. Eastern time tomorrow with Sean and Dan for the morning meeting, and then back here tomorrow night, same time. Have a great night, and thanks to Michael Abramowitz as well, and appreciate you all being part of the two-way community. Good evening.